Mexico Arts Imaginative Collective welcomes you to Sense of Wonder Experience Docu-Moments. In this program, 4 Albuquerque artists, a poet, visual artist, filmmaker, and modeler, illustrate their creative journeys in video. The poet describes the foothills in poetry and photo essays. The visual artist takes you into his studio and down Route 66 for a look at art in neon. The filmmaker gives you a behind-the-scenes look at his storytelling. And the modeler invites you to experience his passion for the model railroad he designs and constructs. Come along with us. The artist's journeys are about to begin.
I live in the Albuquerque foothills. During the pandemic, I began hiking the trails near my house. At the end of the year, at home, I was surprised to find that I'd taken 2,500 photographs documenting my walks. Each time I hiked, I wondered if I would discover something new. I was never disappointed. Foothills in winter. We settle into shades of brown in the foothills in winter. Time inches towards stasis in the shadow of Sandia Crest. We seek out patterns in bird tracks and snow, in detritus of calcified branches. We listen for the woodpeckers rapping in Morse code on tree bark. There's the expected. Clouds mass from the north the night before a storm. Canyon winds roar down a wind tunnel, stopped by a corner fence where 5 saplings refuse to grow. Fingertip shadows reach gingerly across mountain trails. There's the unexpected. Cactus, once green and supple, turns pale yellow, pink, and purple. A hang glider hovers in space, parallel to the rugged rock summit. A massive doe moves stealthily across my line of sight, vanishing into the mountain terrain. Blotches of color glimmer seductively on the face of granite in a torrent of afternoon light. Doe. 20 feet ahead on the mountain trail, you appeared like a silent specter. You moved with the finesse of my husband's heavy-set prima, the best salsa dancer in the family. Unblinking, you saw me, but pretended neither of us existed. I followed your ruse, stumbling with the camera shutter in the afternoon glare. You maneuvered your massive frame through the scrub, your brown coat camouflaged into the fall panorama. I trailed with my lens as you stole towards higher terrain. Soundless, the foothills swallowed you up. Your presence remains. Patination. Geology traces the imprint of time and pressure on rock. A process in slow motion, it exacts irreversible change in shape and form. The rigid and pockmarked rocks of South Sandia Peak are granite, that elder statesman of geologic pageantry. A billion years in the making, the granite formed from molten rock deep within the earth. The rock is far older than the Rio Grande rift that plucked it out of repose, rudely thrusting it thousands of feet in elevation. It reigns under the shadow of Sandia Crest, holding court amid meandering trails and endless scrub and cactus. One winter afternoon before the snows, I trudge up the path skirting the arroyo. At the trailhead, I see a hulking granite boulder, almost my height. After shooting photos, I retrace my steps to reach the rock, now glimmering in sunlight. Spotting colored patches on the granite surface, I aim my camera blindly into the brightness. Later, I discover photos with veins of color moving from navy to purple on the rock face. Art with the finesse of paint flung through space by Jackson Pollock. A friend calls it patina, a term used by sculptors applying color to bronze. The geologic term is surface phenomena, skin-deep tone formed by chemicals colliding in open air. The result? Natural patina. Nature trying her hand at abstract art.
I'm a filmmaker because I'm also a writer, and I just think of film as a different media for telling stories. Ultimately, it always comes back to the story. I have made many documentaries, and I've done them on different subjects, and some of them I've written about, but there are even some that in the process of making the films, I discovered something that a topic that or characters, people that I wanted to go more in depth into and know about, and so I ended up researching or or interviewing them and writing about them. And sometimes I think that when you write, you have to reflect on what's out there objectively, but you also sometimes need to seek out other ways of verifying the truth. The truth of the story of the 3 words of wisdom is that I think those 3 words of wisdom applied then and now and will apply in the future. I think that we have a great need for wisdom and truth in this previous period right here of things that we've gone through. And I think telling the truths that are universal and that are timeless it's very important to the rebuilding of our culture. So basically the 3 words of wisdom, or los tres consejos, it's a bilingual tale in Spanish and English, is one that's been told for decades and decades, and it's usually told by an elder to a younger person, and the transmission of wisdom and truths and experiences from one generation to the next is a very important part of the preservation of cultures. And also it's good both for the teller and for the listener. I think that this type of a tale is something that can be shared in schools, but it can be written about and it can be studied, and it can also be adapted. The thing about a good story is I think that many times you can just change the names of the characters and the location and the time period, and if it's a universal story, it's still going to carry over. And so I do think, though, that we do need to have stories that are still coming out of our hearts and are being shared with other people, because that's what makes us human. In fact, when I was thinking, when you asked me about talking about storytelling, I was thinking about this story about stories, and it's a story about a Jewish rabbi who gets approached by his people who are having to face a very critical, something was happening to the tribe. And so what the rabbi did was he went out into the forest and he lit a fire and he said a special prayer, and sure enough, the disaster was averted. And so I guess many years later, probably the rabbi was dead, but one of his disciples was approached by his people for the same purpose, that there was a crisis coming up, and could he help them out? And he says, well, sure. So he went out to the place in the forest, and he lit the candle, but he had forgotten the prayer. But he basically just felt that that was sufficient, and sure enough, when he got back, that disaster was averted. Later on, it fell to another one of his disciples, and he goes out and he finds a place in the forest, but he doesn't have the candle. He doesn't have knowledge of the prayer. He's forgotten it, but he just remains, and things go fine. Finally, there's a last disciple of the disciple of the disciple of the disciple, and he doesn't even know where the place in the forest is. So he's sitting at his desk, and he tells the creator of the universe, he says, I'm not going to light a candle. I don't remember the prayer. I don't even remember the place in the forest where to go to, but I still have the same intention that I would like to see good to come out of this. And sure enough, the danger was averted one more time. And the saying is, God made people because he loves stories. And so stories about stories are very, very important. That's why I think even a documentary about storytelling is very important.
Los Tres Consejos, the 3 Words of Wisdom, adapted by Rudy J. Miera. Una vez there were these 3 poor men. 2 of them had big families, pero el otro had only a boy. He was studying to be a priest. Un día, thinking about their poverty and the size of their familias, they decided to go look for work. They got all ready and then they left town. En el camino, they met a viejito who asked them where they were going. They said, "A buscar trabajo," to look for work. The old man said,
"What would you rather have, a bag full of money or 3 words of wisdom?"
Two of them responded.
We want the money.
The man with the son said,
I will take los 3 consejos, the 3 words of wisdom.
Well then, the old man gave the sacks of dinero to the first 2 men, and to the other he said,
First, don't leave the well-traveled road for the path. Second, don't ask about things that aren't any of your business. The third, don't go by what you first see. Be careful with first impressions. Con cuidado.
He then told them adios, and then he went. They were left solitos, and the 2 hombres who chose the money said al otro hombre, "Man, did you ever choose wrong? What good are those words of wisdom going to do for you? ¿De qué sirven?" Pueda que those 3 words of advice will serve me better than the sacks of money will serve you. Bueno, ya me voy. And I'll leave you gentlemen with the first consejo. Don't leave the well-traveled road for the path. ¿Me entienden? Ah, ¿qué sabes tú? Le dijeron. De ahí, they went through the path, and the man went through the well-traveled road ahead. The 2 returned, but on the camino, some robbers los mataron. They actually killed him and took off with the gold. The man of los 3 consejos went ahead until he got to una ciudad, a city. He arrived at a very large house, where he asked for lodging, because era muy tarde, very late at night, y muy oscuro, and very dark. El hombre de la casa came out, very gentlemanly, and he took him in and fed him supper. Después, he took him to a room where he could see his wife, who was muy flaca, as skinny as a skeleton. The man of los 3 consejos felt like asking the gentleman why she was so flaca, but just then he remembered el otro consejo, so he didn't ask. Now, este hombre, muy rico, had land and lots of servants. He immediately offered the traveler a job. The other workers at the ranch house would usually ask why the man had his wife the way she was, and he would then fire them or kill them. You see, the man had made a promise, una promesa, to see if there would be una persona, just one single person, who would not ask why he had his mujer tan flaquita. ¿Sabes qué? He had said that he would keep her that way until el día when he met a person who would not ask why he kept her like that. That person who didn't ask would then become the owner of all that he had. Thought the master. The last man who I hired had just done his trabajo and hadn't asked about anything. Un día decía el patrón al trabajador, "Señor, ¿por qué tú no me preguntas? Why do you not ask me why I keep my wife like I do?" "Señor, porque a mí no me gusta preguntar lo que no me importa. I never ask what does not concern me." "Bien dicho," the master answered. "Finally, one who doesn't stick his nose where it doesn't belong. Ahora, you will be the owner of all that I have, and I will no longer treat my wife badly, but lovingly." The traveler of los 3 consejos became very glad. The rich man gave him everything and took off for Albuquerque, the big city. The traveler, now that he had received his property, decided to go get his familia and bring them back to the Casa Grande. With his pistola in his bolsa, he ran off. Cuando llegó a su casa, back home, he peeked into la ventana, and what did he see?
A young priest hugging his wife. Él se sintió enojado and he thought of killing his wife. He reached for his pistola, but just then he remembered el tercero consejo. No te partas con la primera nueva. Don't go by your first impression and jump to conclusions.
Entonces, He listened to his wife speaking to the young priest, and he realized that it was his very own son, su propio hijo. The traveler went in, and his familia cried for joy. Y fíjate, con la fortuna, with that large fortune that the rico had given him, they lived happily ever after. El que me oye este cuento, que me cuente otro.
Now you've heard my story, I hope it makes you wise. Tell me your story now, to enrich both our lives.
Artists document things. They document what they feel, what they imagine. Their works reflect their impressions and visions, their dreams and inspirations. History and culture are among the many influences in my life. I strive to make connections with the past so I can relate it to my art in the present. Join me as I draw my journey, documenting my experiences traveling along Route 66 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a byway rich in multicultural history. It is adorned with classical architecture, with reflections of the Southwestern visionaries who built it and embellished it with their own ideas. In tune with a New Mexico composer and filmmaker, we travel the road together to celebrate our art and New Mexico's history. Join us and let the history, art, and music inspire you too.
So I know you're an avid model railroader, but let's back up and start with the basics. So tell me about where you grew up, what you did for a living, how you got interested in model railroading, and any other hobbies you have.
Okay, that'll be a 60-year story. Right now I'm retired. My brother and I grew up in Roswell, and we had a basement in our house, and we spent most of the summers in the basement because it was so much cooler. So there was an American Flyer. My brother had that from when he was a kid, and we spent countless hours in the basement running that American Flyer train through the Lincoln Logs and the Green Army soldiers, and just having tons of fun in the basement. It wasn't a hobby per se, as it was just kids playing. But then my parents got us an HO gauge layout that a guy made for them. It was just basically a circular track with a few switches. And we built Little Town and put down the fake grass and had a good time with that. And so I did HO for a good long period of time, and then went off to college, and my parents threw it all away, as they so often do. The American Flyer set, though, they were smart enough to save, and my brother still has that, although he doesn't run it much. But I went off to college, and then somewhere along the line, my wife found an N-gauge layout that somebody had donated to a place. So I bought it and brought it home, set it up in the family room that we had, and had great fun with it for years, till she finally decided she needed a music studio. And 1989, it was off to garden railroading. First, I went to community college to learn to be a machinist. Then I got kind of tired of being a machinist. So I went to UNM, got a degree in education. And 1980, I graduated and I went to work for the local community college teaching machine shop. So I did 25 years with them, retired with a pension. And then, brilliant enough, one of my students called me up and asked me to come to work for him. He graduated about 10 years prior to my retirement, and then I went to work for him. He was managing a machine shop at a laser place, and he had about 15 machinists working for him. And I went to work to improve the efficiency of the machine shop. And he hired me as an applications engineer. And so off I went, walked into the machine shop to take a tour, and lo and behold, 10 of the 15 people working there were my former students.
So what do you do to keep yourself out of trouble then while you're retired?
Well, my wife is a videographer and professional musician. And so right with that, I'm her technical, I call it wrangler. And I keep all her computer stuff, cameras, and all that working. But also I have a garden railroad in the backyard. And I've been working on it for the past few years because it was kind of neglected and deteriorated being outside.
So with a machine shop in your garage, you could theoretically build real locomotives.
The Bridgeport mill and the little lathe are not quite big enough to make full-size locomotives, but I do a lot of modeling with them. So yeah, I could, but mainly I stick with my gauge, which everybody calls G gauge, but I think the technical term for it is F, narrow gauge, 3 feet. 120.3 is the scale.
All right. So What do you find most attractive about building model railroads?
It's an outlet for my creative talents.
So do you consider this an art or a craft?
I think of it as art. I took a picture of one of my garden railroads, and they had an art show, and it was garden was the theme. So I took some pictures of my garden railroad. I turned them into sepia. I made them look like old-timey 1900s black and white kind of pictures. And I entered them into the garden show. And the curator of the artwork said, many people came up and said, oh, it's a wonderful show, but why does that guy have pictures of trains? And so the proprietor of the show said, you need to go back and look closer at those photographs. And when people did, they went, oh my God, it's a model. It's not a real picture of a full-size locomotive. And so they were very impressed with that, and he was too. So it's a creative outlet.
So I know you're in a garden railroad club. How does that figure in?
Fun. The Garden Railroad Club is quite fun. You get to see all the different people and see what they've done with their garden railroads. And everybody's is different. Some people are collectors. Some people just want to run their trains and have a good time. And some people like me want to do real intricate modeling aspect of the railroad. And we have a club within that group called the Builder Bashers. And it's the people that do modeling by bashing kits together and making their own projects and that kind of thing. Also, the club, you get to participate in the history of railroads, because I've been a big buff of the narrow gauge railroads that operated in northern New Mexico as well as southern Colorado.
Well, tell me about that. How many railroads were there? We know about the Santa Fe. Were there others?
Yes, there was quite a narrow gauge railroad empire that operated on 3-foot wide track. Standard gauge is 4 feet, 8.5, I think, which is an interesting story, because the standard gauge railroad is based on a standard that was developed 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Roman chariot wheels were made to a standard so they would fit through the stepping stones in streets. So in England, when they built the railroads, they had to get to those same gaps where the Romans had settled over 2,000 years ago. So when they did that, they built the track to fit through those openings. And to this day, we still adhere to that Roman standard of 2,000 years ago. But a lot of railroads are built in smaller gauges. And in Colorado, where the mountains and the grades were really difficult, they elected to build a lot of railroads in 3-foot gauge. And the most famous of those is the Denver and Rio Grande Western. And it operated in the mountains of Colorado west of Denver. It actually still exists on the Cumbres and Toltec and the Durango Silverton. Those two lines belong to the Denver and Rio Grande and were preserved as operating narrow gauge railroad.
At one time, the Denver and Rio Grande went down as far as Santa Fe, right?
Yes, that's true. It operated on a railroad line called the Chile Line from Antonito down to Santa Fe. And my railroad in the backyard kind of models that railroad. It was built, it went into bankruptcy the day it started operating, and it continued to operate for many years, all the way into the 40s. As a matter of fact, Oppenheimer rode that railroad to go to the town of Ottawa, where he got a horse and rode up to Los Alamos, and then they developed the facility that made the first atomic bomb there in Los Alamos. Somewhere there's a video or movie of him getting off that train car and going up to Los Alamos. That's a very intriguing thing to see, that old 1880s steam type equipment, and knowing that they're going to build the first atomic bomb, which is not just a whole new chapter in the world's history, but a whole new book. So it intrigues me. And I made sure I bought that passenger car that had that number that he's getting off of.
It's an amazing connection.
It is. It's phenomenal.
It seems like today, railroads in general, and model railroads as well, don't have the same kind of presence in the public mind that they did, say, for our parents' generation. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think the younger people don't have the experience of riding a passenger train. When I was a kid, probably about 8 years old, we took the Santa Fe Super Chief from Albuquerque to Chicago. Was all compartments. So everybody had a private room. And we made that trip in probably about a day and a half. It was quite fast, quite elegant, dinner in the diner. And it was something that I remember distinctly. And I don't think kids have that opportunity today. Railroads are very important to the transportation of goods of the United States. Santa Fe, Burlington, Union Pacific, those two railroads probably move 90% of the freight east-west on double track at really high speeds. And they're a very important part of our lives today, even though we don't realize it. So I don't think the younger generations that are growing up now get to experience that.
We just don't have that much contact with it, huh?
No, occasionally when you're taking Route 66, I-40 West, you parallel that Santa Fe line and you see a huge amount of traffic, but people just don't think much of it. You know, another thing too, back when I was a kid, they used boxcars, and every company had their own boxcars, and everybody's boxcar had their logo and painting, stuff like that on it. But nowadays, it's all nondescript containers stacked too high and 5 long on freight trains that pull 500 of those containers at a time. So probably doesn't have quite the fun that it did back in the day, back in the 60s and 50s.
Well, let's talk about your Garden Railroad.
Okay.
What made you decide to build where you built? I mean, I know you're on a steep hill. That seems like an impossible place to put a model railroad. How'd you do it?
Well, when we had another house, and in the backyard, it was perfectly flat. And that's the way most garden railroads are, just horizontal backyard with track going around. And ours was the same way. And we had lived in the house 20 years and paid it off. And we were thinking about moving to a slightly larger house. And so we started looking around, and we found this house in the foothills of Albuquerque that the backyard is on a mountain, and at our back wall, it's probably 20 feet higher than the backyard. And so Karen said, "Oh, but you won't be able to build a railroad back there." And I said, "Oh, yes, I will." So we invited the Garden Railroader Club over, and they helped us take up all the track, and they brought their pickups and vans, and we moved all the track and buildings up to the new house. And then we had a party in the backyard, and I gave everybody a blank piece of paper, and I had them come up with ideas on how to fit the railroad up that probably 30-degree incline. And everybody came up with a little plan, and we had a marvelous time, cookout and planning. And I incorporated the ideas that everybody came up with, and off we went. First thing we had done was we built a 2-car garage, and I made it 28 feet deep to put 2 cars in, and also have room for the railroad in the back of it. Because one thing I noticed is you have a garden railroad, you don't really want to keep all your equipment out in the back on the track, or the rain and sun and everything will fade out the equipment. And I did more damage to my equipment taking it out of where I stored it, putting it on the track, running it, and then putting it back up. And that also led to the fact that I don't feel like I want to get the equipment out. So I incorporated an area to stage the trains in the back of the garage, and put 2 little doggy door kind of things in. And all the equipment is parked on the track. If I want to run, just open up the door and turn on my cell phone, which I use to control the trains. They're battery powered, and off we go. And it's worked out really well. So it's a loop to loop. That is, it goes down to one end and around a loop, then goes back on the same track to another loop and back again. And then you have to back the equipment back up into the garage. So it's great fun. It's easy to work. It's battery powered. I don't have to worry about track connections and electricity. And I just have to make sure there are no rocks or animals or anything else on the rails when I take off. A little bit of maintenance and away we go. I picked a 4% grade because back in the day, that's what the Cumbres and Toltec, which was the Denver and Rio Grande, had from Chama up to Cumbres Pass. So they pull 4 or 5 passenger cars. They have to have at least 2 locomotives to get that equipment to the top of that hill. And so I had great fun with that too, developing a 4% grade up that hill in the backyard. As a consequence, I destroyed the gear train on all the locomotives I have that had plastic gears in them. So being a machinist, okay, we'll fix that. So I take the locomotive apart, redo the gearbox, put in all stainless steel gears, and maybe a little bit bigger, more powerful motor, and up we go the hill. As a matter of fact, I've re-geared all my locomotives to have lower gear ratio that allows them to pull that steeper grade without straining.
Explain what a 4% grade is, will you?
A 4% grade, the locomotive on my layout is going to gain 4 feet in 100. So it's going up 4 feet in a length of 100 feet. The angle works out to about 3 degrees, which doesn't sound like much, but when you stand there and look at it, you know, most of my friends that bring their railroad equipment over go, no thanks. I'm not going to put my equipment through that torture. So 4% grade is pretty steep. I've had cars uncouple up that grade and run away, and down the hill they go. And usually when they hit the first curve, they derail and come off.
Well, it sounds like quite a chore to build a railroad in that kind of terrain.
It was a torture to build them in Colorado, and it was also a torture to build them in my backyard.
What do you have to do differently than say, building an HO layout in your basement?
Well, I have to contend with the weather. I have to contend with here in Albuquerque, we get half an inch of rain in 15 minutes and the dirt all washes down. So one thing that I'm doing now is I'm replacing the original dirt grade with a concrete. And so I set up my level. I calculate a 4% grade. I use a laser level and I put the string down and I level off the dirt and I'm pouring concrete up that grade for the track to set on because I'm not getting any younger.
How does a plastic building hold up outside, or does it?
They make a lot of plastic building kits that you can buy, and they're made in Germany. And the plastic that they use is really good. But of course, they fade out, the colors fade, and the glue seams come apart. And so you have to do maintenance on them. I built a bunch out of wood, and about 10 years was the limit. Then the wood started deteriorating and falling apart. I tried gluing them back together and it worked fairly well. But sometimes I'd get a big wind, and when I went out, the sill at the bottom of the wooden building would still be attached to the concrete base. But my neighbor would call and say, hey, I've got Angus's machine shop over here in my backyard. You need to come and get it. So the wind would just rip it off the foundation. So a newer technique I've discovered is cold rolled steel. If you want a building to last, make it out of cold rolled steel. And I have a friend in a business who has a plasma cutter, and he cuts the walls out with the windows and the door. And then I glue this vinyl siding, and then I paint it with 20-year exterior latex paint, and they're holding up exceptionally well. So that's a new route I'm going. And I've built about 6 or 7 buildings with that technique. And the main thing is they're heavy enough, they don't blow away.
Yeah. Most of us have model railroads that have wires connected to a transformer and the track, but you're saying you use batteries and some kind of remote control. How does this remote control work?
You know, even the inside HO people and O gauge people and all of them have trouble where those little connectors go together on the railroad track. And a lot of them, I think the HO people solder them so that they have a permanent connection. But you have 700 feet of track. On a hot summer day, the track expands and contracts and it would break and crack, and you can't do that. And so when you try to run the power through the rails, the two problems that you get are those connectors lose continuity and the track gets oxidation on top of it. And for years and years, I tried to operate with a battery-powered locomotive. And the first one I started with was a model airplane, remote control, and nickel cadmium batteries. But the batteries weren't very good and the radio wasn't very good and nothing worked out well with it. But with the invention of nickel metal hydride batteries, everything became a whole new ballgame. And so that gave me enough power and enough durability that it worked out well. But the radio control was still an issue. When I was working for my friend at the laser business, we had coating chambers, and we were modernizing the coating chambers with programmable controllers. And so we were working on a project with that. And I discovered, my gosh, we can control these things with a cell phone using Bluetooth. And Bluetooth is used quite a bit for speaker communication, other things. And so the engineer and I, during the lunch hour, would try to figure out how we were going to get this cell phone and this Bluetooth to link to these programmable controllers. so I could run them with my cell phone. And we did, and it worked very successfully. So all of my locomotives are now cell phone controlled, using batteries and a Bluetooth connection. The operation is spectacular. I can ring bells, I can blow whistles, I can stop and start, I can check the power consumption, I know what the batteries are, everything with the cell phone. So it's worked out exceptionally well.
So how many trains overall do you have, and do you have a favorite?
Let me think. I have a little 040, which is a logging road train that I pull, and it has a few log cars and a couple of frac cars with some wood on them, and a old steam engine they're taking to the mine, and then not a caboose but a work car at the end. And I think it's my favorite. The little wheels, it's just four-wheel cars, not the big ones with the articulated trucks. And it bounces and bobs along just like you'd expect that little locomotive to do on the hills. So I think it's one of my favorites. But I also have a newer locomotive. It's a 2662 Mallet, and it has two wheels in the front, little pilot wheels, six wheels that drive, then six more wheels that drive, and then two wheels in the back. And they made a lot of them as logging locomotives, used them actually in Colorado on the Uinta line, and they used a lot of them in Washington, Oregon, and California for logging locomotives. And I like that one because there's so many moving parts on it, valve gear and side rods, and it's a beautiful locomotive, and it's got plenty of power to pull. And then of course everybody's favorite is the Shay, and 90% of people go, what's a Shay? And a Shay locomotive was invented in the 1890s, and it's a steam engine, but it uses a gear drive like you'd expect on a diesel type of locomotive. And it uses a gear drive to get more leverage to get it up the hill. And that locomotive is the best to run when you have a whole bunch of people over. It never stalls, it never stops, it never comes off the rails. It just goes and goes. So those are my three favorite locomotives. I have a few others, but they aren't as much fun to operate as those three.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned getting a 3D printer and building 600 things with it. What sort of things are you building? And I assume these go on your model railroad?
Yes, I made a whole bunch of parts for the La Grande Imperial Hotel. 9 rooms, bathroom down the hall. It's neither Grand nor Imperial. But I used the 3D printer to make all that fancy trim they put on the top of those old 1880s buildings in Colorado. In fact, my wife and I went on a trip just to look at the construction of those buildings to get ideas on how they did that. And I used the 3D printer to make a lot of the windows and doors and those things. Plus, I've made a lot of detail parts for the locomotives, just little things, stakes to go in the flat car, new lanterns to go on the side of the passenger car at the end, also on the caboose. I bought these really nice brass ones, and bunk, it got hooked on a tree, and it's laying somewhere in the dirt in the backyard, never to be seen again. So have a 3D printer, no problem. Just look up the original drawing for the original Denver and Rio Grand Lantern, draw it up in full scale, scale it down to 120.3, off to the 3D printer, little sanding, little painting, and stick it back on. Should it come off and get lost? No problem.